So good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to the second part of today's session. And I'm very delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Lindsey Askin from Cambridge. She's recently completed a PhD under the supervision of Jim Aitken, and her thesis, The Scribal Culture in Ben Sira, which is going to be coming published very soon by Brill in the Brill series. And Lindsey writes in a number of areas, particularly in relation to scribal culture and material culture, and also some other material on medicine and patronage. And she's going to give us a paper this afternoon for this Bookish Circles on the topic of the social stratification of scribes and readers in Greco-Roman Judaism.
So, the social stratification of scribes and readers in Greco-Roman Judaism. Scribes in the Greco-Roman period, Jewish scribes in the Greco-Roman period and their respective readers have been a great topic of interest in recent scholarship. Sometimes, however, I feel the impression is that scribes are usually imagined as literary elites or proto-monastic sages engaged solely in copying and editing sacred literature, while other lesser hordes of scribes do administrative tasks running the economy somewhere else. Readers are imagined collectively as simultaneously privileged and indiscriminate audiences, at once expecting a high sophistication of thought and style, and yet, as, for example, in the case of much pseudepigraphal literature, expected not to balk at what is, to our eyes, contemporary writing made to look much older than it is. Despite evidence that scribes in the Greek and Roman periods were often of low status and engaged in various administrative tasks besides book copying, as Carol Bakos has argued, most recent scholarship is often focused particularly on the topic of Second Temple scribal culture, which ends up largely removing administrative work from the picture, leaving the impression of scribes as literary copyists only. This picture creates the impression that literature is the only evidence that we have of scribal culture in Second Temple Judaism, or if not the only evidence, that it is instead a better quality type of evidence, or that the main type of text encountered by a Jewish scribe or Jewish reader in antiquity is literature. Reading and writing is then socially stratified between a minority of elite literati and a mass population of semi or illiterate nobodies making awkward inscriptions who add nothing to scribal culture. While my present study focuses on the Greek and Roman periods of Judaism in the Mediterranean, it appears that much of Jewish scribal culture in this era is often assumed to be an automatic extension of context and factors present or assumed in the scribal culture of ancient Israel of the Iron Age and pre-Hellenistic Empire, i.e. very little direct evidence of documents and accounting, but lots of literature. And as I was saying earlier, this is largely due to actual survival due to climate. In scholarship, Jewish scribes seem to be not merely socially stratified from their own readers and the majority of society, but physically and temporally removed from the landscape and daily life of Second Temple Judea, not just in the case of the Qumran community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they're actually physically quite removed from everybody else, but all scribal activity from Jerusalem to the rest of the Mediterranean in Syria, Egypt, and Italy. William Harris's influential study imagined two types of literacy in pre-modern societies, a scribal literacy and a professional or craftsman's literacy. While scholars disagree with Harris's proposed levels of very low or very high 5 to 10% literacy, Harris has given way to other scholarship tending to lay a boundary between the literacy of scribes and that of everybody else. Scribes and readers are removed from the written landscape of documentary, epigraphic, and other kinds of non-literary writing. Recent works such as those of David Carr, William Schneiderwind, Emma Rotchek, and Carol van der Toorn have somehow shaped a default framework for what to look for to find evidence of scribal culture, shaping the discussion to or around evidence of scribes as they learn, write, or edit literature. Mrozek recently argued that the categories of the, quote, biblical and related search for that, quote, biblical in all of Second Temple literature, especially in pseudepigrapha and rewritten scripture, are extremely unhelpful. Using the biblical as a lens and framework limits the scribal imagination of Jewish authors, as she argues, and removes from our sites the variety of authors' strategies and interests, besides simple questions of biblical and canon. Yet as we search instinctively for ways in which the practices of scribes tell us about the formation of the Bible, or the genre of ancient Jewish literature overall, as Moravcsik does, we have relegated other categories of evidence as irrelevant, or at least not as helpful as literature for understanding how scribes worked. Instead of the biblical as a structuring principle, we might instead put literature in place of Bible and canon as framework. Yet a different picture is presented in studies of scribes in, for example, Hellenistic Egypt, where we're lucky to have survival of papyrus, where scribes were the backbone of the entire land's administration, finance, and economic system, with a similar structure in place throughout the Greek and Roman world. In studies by Cribiore, Johnson, Small, Thomas, Clarissa, and others, scribes are mainly administrators, servants, and sometimes copyists below an intellectual elite. Yet Cribiore, Roger Bagnall, and William Johnson also show that while so much documentary evidence of education survives from Greco-Roman Egypt, education was not, in fact, mainly for household servants and acting as scribes, but for most people who could afford it at varying levels. Cribiore, in particular, shows how most school pupils did not become professional scribes. Reading, at least, if not writing, therefore, is not merely an activity of the household slave, but most people in the ancient world to a very wide variety of degrees. The context of letters for Jewish scribes and readers might be extended beyond literary evidence, then, to include epigraphy, documents, petitions, and identifying markers such as inscriptional labels and seals on objects. So I hope to propose a few ways in which documentary and other non-literary evidence might illuminate further scribes' and readers' practices and concerns in their contexts, not to serve towards framing a deeper understanding of the formation of biblical literature, but to broaden our idea of what a Jewish scribe is and a Jewish reader beyond the sacred context in which we usually look for and find them. And these are all very formative thoughts that I'm currently developing into what I hope to be my first postdoctoral project, which is currently titled A Social History of Reading and Writing in Greco-Roman Judaism. My first outstanding problem, then, is that the literary scribes of any late Second Temple setting eclipses other types of scribal activity in a crucial period of change in state bureaucracy records, along with the problems of survival of papyri. The integration of evidence is a methodological problem, as pointed out by Catherine Heythrop. Archaeological and documentary sources serve as handmaidens to other disciplines of history, biblical and rabbinic studies, used to justify or explain what we like. The second problem at the outset of this investigation is that very little analysis explores the Jewish reader beyond collective social and religious identifying markers. While it is sometimes acknowledged in recent scholarship that reading was far more common than writing in the ancient world, the stereotyped collective Jewish reader remains a mirror reflection of the scribe. The reader is also passive and receptive, interested only in elite reading and never popular reading, stratified and segregated physically from the scribe in a quiet, solitary setting of sacred reading or oral performance. In this framework, little room remains for the reader to decide to read anything else besides sacred texts. No time or space is given to expressions of popular writing or mundane, everyday reading of inventories, graffiti, shop labels, taxes. Yet readers and audiences underpin any discussion of Second Temple texts in our commentaries. So why then do we continue to imagine them in such a one-dimensional way, or bulk them all together, and place literature on a higher tier than documents and wall scratchings? What if then, for example, readers were reading inventories and contracts every day of the year, and sacred texts only once a week, or even far less, who knows, a few times a year, or once a year, or a couple times in their lifetime, and scribes tally accounts and copy repetitive formulas most of the year, or for much of their own career during their life? Does such a balance of exposure to material have an effect on how those scribes and readers understand each other and how they saw lists and contracts in, for example, Hebrew scripture and Second Temple literature. So I hope to explore this with a few examples. So the first sort of topic is wages and archives and things. In historiographical literature, numeracy is taken with a pinch of salt. Numbers and even lists such as inventories or genealogies become interpretive, political, or religious statements. We might ask when accuracy matters in numeracy. In the Hebrew Bible, numbers do not need to be exact with armies and tribes, even Solomon's wives and the size of royal treasuries. Symbolic round numbers tend to look nicer in a narrative and give us a sense that numbers mean whatever the scribe wants them to mean, and that readers have a similar liberal or symbolic sense of numeracy. For example, during the imprisonment of the bad king Jehoiakim, the price of Pharaoh Necho's tax on Jerusalem, his exacting price in 2 Kings 24 seems to be quite accurate. With a ring of truth to it, 100 talents of silver and 1 talent of gold. In 2 Kings 6, the siege of Samaria by the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, lasts so long that, quote, there was a great famine in the city. The siege lasted so long that a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver and a quarter of a cab of seed pods for 5 shekels. What a deal. The price of a chariot imported from Egypt for Solomon's stables in 2 Chronicles 1 is exactly 600 shekels of silver, and a horse costs 150, although I assume some bargaining probably happened. Yet then Solomon employs exactly 70,000 basket carriers, 80,000 couriers, and 3,600 supervisors for his mines. The census of David in 2 Samuel 24, never mind the estimated numbers of men in Israel and Judah available for conscription, but the divinely sent pestilence to punish David for this sentence kills an even 70,000 people from Dan to Beersheba. And perhaps it was because he rounded off the numbers. Wages, taxes, and prices in the Hebrew Bible do have a nicely realistic sound to them. Yet in other types of numbers, especially of people and in genealogies and chronologies, numbers shift to estimates and often get inflated. This tells us something, I think, about human ability to imagine very large numbers and what sounds nice in a narrative. But we might also see these types of numbers in light of documentary evidence. Thus, we can compare values and attitudes towards numeracy from literature to daily life, which is important when you consider that scribes are the administrative backbone of a country, writing receipts, balancing the books, determining how many shekels it takes to buy a horse, or donkey's head for that matter. And yet also the copyists of literature in which we have all these nice symbolic numerals. So the first example that I have is on your handout. I don't have any words, I just have some nice pictures of scribes. Actually. Yes. So he's not a scribe, he's actually a craftsman, and that's a physician with his library. So I've put them side by side. But yes, so a petition of Judas, son of Dositheus, to Sopirion regarding the action of his village scribe, Mares, who's raised the rent on him. You can all read it for yourself, but basically he's saying, I only rent, my rent is only 4 abatai of wheat, and Mares has unwittingly or wittingly raised it to 5 2/3, which is like 30% increase, and that's quite a lot, so he's in dire straits. In this case, a Jewish farmer has submitted a petition, and these are quite formulaic, and I would imagine he had some conversations with the petition scribe at the office who helped him make his case. The scribe then makes 2 copies, one for the office and one for Zopyrus, the higher official, the addressee. So in the Ptolemaic government in this time, the village scribe and the village chief, the Komogrammateos, and village chief, together had the important role of annually reviewing the land holdings throughout the entire empire. And those numbers then go to higher levels up to toparchs, and then nomarchs, and then to Alexandria. And this is where things have gone seriously wrong for Judas, son of Dositheus of Philadelphia. So Maurus, the Commogromateus, has for whatever reason increased the rental of his land of Judas's land tenancy by a considerable amount, by 30%. The reason he has done this is unclear. Maurus probably gets no considerable profit from increasing the numbers at this stage, actually. As Rostovtsev writes, government officials at the village level had very little profit in compensation for the dangerous nature of their jobs. Basically, they could get lynched. Maurus might have made a mistake then, and I think it went to the higher levels, and Judas is therefore in a very dangerous and risky position of ensuring that his rent will not leave him penniless. So he's just depending quite a lot on the accuracy of his local scribe. So comparing this kind of scribal error, I think is interesting because we often look for scribal errors in literary manuscripts. In this case, accounting might have actually gone wrong, or perhaps there is no mistake and Maurus just has a really bad grudge against Judas, but I'm not really quite sure that's the case. We don't know the outcome of this case, as unfortunately the copy of this petition doesn't have, like on the back it says like approved or one-word decision. It's kind of broken off in this example. Another example I'll move to is the number 2 on your handout, and these are some examples of tax receipts issued by Jewish tax farmers from around the mid-2nd century, most of them. So you can read these yourself. You know, it's very formulaic. You know, I have received this much. I've 4,000 drachma in copper, etc. For example, in the first one, but unusual sort of written by Delos at the request of Simon because he is illiterate. And there's quite a few examples of these. You can read them. However, so 108, the second one, is sort of formulated like a letter, so it's directed to him individually as a person. It's like, you have paid me this much, and so understand when I give you my receipt, that is what I'm saying, is a direct sort of communication. So in these cases, the tax farmers writing the receipts happen to be Jewish, and in some cases, the recipient is also Jewish. These are examples where the tax has been paid and the taxpayer receives their written evidence of that. Copies are made for the record office as well. Perhaps these are cases where the taxpayer has absolutely no care for what is written exactly, as in the case of the illiterate man, but again, that literacy in the ancient world is not a marker of socioeconomic status. You could just say, I don't really write that much, I can write my name, that's about it. That doesn't give you a low reputation. And Simon, son of Jazaros, simply holds on to his very, very valuable slip of papyrus to show the authorities if they come calling. But if you pay this tax every year, you're going to have a lot of slips and rifle through them quite a lot. But in the other cases, the tax receipt is addressed directly to the taxpayer, the reader. Here the numbers matter exactly. The writing is driven towards the sort of service user. So I kind of call this myself kind of like service user driven, kind of like, and the written formula strictly adheres to the rules of accounting. So exact numbers. The scribe may be the tax farmer or assistant scribe traveling with him. Another reason that taxes are interesting, said nobody ever, is because of the care taken in Ptolemaic period to record what people have paid exactly. And the Ptolemaic banking system was famously sophisticated. During this time, I think there's increasing reason and culture for having payments in written form. When injustice strikes, written documents help. Thus, I think that these are not merely mundane articles of daily life, but in fact, kind of life-saving tax receipts for their recipients, and perhaps for the tax farmer as well, as he depends on their accuracy not to be lynched. If there is anywhere people are hurt the most, it is over money. Perhaps then we should think slightly more of documents of accounting such as these, which would, I imagine, be kept incredibly safe in one's house for a long time, alongside other written important things, such as household property deeds, tenancy agreements, contracts, and other written sources. And so in this light, I am beginning to think it is unfair to suggest that these documents were all either just completely illegible to their owners, or if readable, that they just thought of them as ordinary slips of paper, ordinary pieces of papyri that held far less meaning for most people than we might think that literature did. We must remember that reading was far more common than writing skills in the ancient world. A final note on these documentary sources is that we can see that readers of all levels are expected to interact with the scribes and tax farmers about the contents and the exact numbers of these taxes, of inventories and censuses on a number of levels. The scribe therefore has to interact with the people around him and cannot be removed into a different solitary environment when we consider questions of accuracy and scribal error. So scribal errors are kind of become like a social issue of communication. Errors can come from anybody in the vicinity speaking with the scribe. In the case of genealogies and symbolic numbers, like in the numbers of large amounts of people then, our scribes held to a different set of expectations in storytelling, representing and communicating with an audience in symbolic numbers than they are with administration. The next example I'll move on to are some funerary inscriptions, which is number 3 on the handout. So a different type of evidence for reading and writing in ancient Judaism consists of inscriptions. In Schwartz's recent study, he argues for ancient Israel and Second Temple Judaism as being part of Mediterraneanism, meaning that the Mediterranean pre-modern societies functioned in an environment of limited natural resources, distributed between individuals and levels primarily by means of reciprocity, the classical definition of the bonds of friendship, giving this for that. While ancient Israel and early Judaism has been said to rebel against such ideas because of charity, in practice, Schwartz demonstrates how most Mediterranean societies also had similar reactions of ideas like charity to offset the system of reciprocity. So charity kept the system of reciprocity in balance. I've looked at this question most recently in the context of Ben Sira, which I hope in a study I hope to publish soon, arguing for the possibility that Simon the high priest is the patron of Ben Sira in some way, to kind of explain the praise, lots of praise of Simon, but no clear lamentation as you would expect in a eulogy, and is usually interpreted as a eulogy. But I digress. In funerary inscriptions, we have another excellent resource of evidence for Jewish patronage in at least the Roman period. For example, the first inscription of Nicetas the proselyte, whose patroness Dionysius paid for his tomb, as any good, wealthy Roman citizen would do for someone dependent on them. So there's about 14 extant inscriptions which talk specifically about Jewish proselytes, and proselytes usually have a patron. And most of these inscriptions are from Italy and Judea. But to a slightly different scenario of patronage, other inscriptions mention gifts of land for a tomb by Jewish patrons, sort of en masse, such as the next example on the second page of Livius Dionysius and Antonius, who have given quite a lot of money and land to the Jewish community in Ostia, burial space there. I particularly like the last line: a copy of this inscription has been deposited in the record office. Oh, sorry, that's not it. Up again. I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah, it's just the burial space. So there are many hints of reciprocity earlier in the mid-3rd century BCE, such as the relationship between Zenon, the right hand of Apollonius, who was Ptolemy's finance minister, and Joseph ben Tobias, as evidence in the Zenon archive. Tobias sends gifts to Zenon and to Ptolemy at various stages, a practice demonstrating, I would argue, the strengthening of a reciprocal relationship, friendship. Later examples from Judea would be the building projects of Herod the Great, at once employment and economic injection, but these are also established ways in Hellenistic society of developing a stronger relationship of reciprocity with the people. This is done, for example, in the support and tax relief given by the Seleucid ruler to Jerusalem in the Seleucid Charter of Jerusalem recorded by Josephus. Patronage or reciprocity becomes quite formalized in Roman times, and I think we usually associate it with literary patronage, but is clearly a lot bigger than that. But its basic principles are well established in the Mediterranean from an early stage. And reciprocity is an important relationship to publicly announce in writing, and therefore it's interesting to have written expressions of Jewish patronage. So we can become interested in the readers and writers behind funerary inscriptions for another reason besides patronage. We might ask who exactly are the writers and readers behind in such inscriptions, not just those about patronage, but at all levels and skills, down to the single word inscriptions that are kind of slanted and they don't look as fancy and nice. Are the readers of inscriptions only other wealthy, literate people? Or as in the case of patronage inscriptions en masse, do readers include people who are patronized? And then what are we assuming about people who need patronizing, like the Jewish community of Ostia? This turns us towards the idea of functional or professional literacy, approached recently by Greg Wolfe, as well as the volume edited by Johnson and Parker, who argue for numerous levels of literacies instead of one ideal of literacy. In the two inscriptions we just read, one inscription is in the Jewish catacombs of Rome, where only 18% of inscriptions are in Latin, and the rest are mostly in Greek, in Aramaic, or Hebrew. Again, we can't tell. The second inscription is within the Jewish catacomb in Castel Porziano near Ostia. There are other patronage-related funerary inscriptions in Judea which are in Greek. So who are their intended audiences? Perhaps we might guess they are to be read by other Latin-speaking Jews, or optimistically were done in Latin, hoping that in the future more Jews would learn Latin. But I sense that they are meant to be read by other Latin-speaking Jews of their kinds, making a priority out of communicating status rather than just imparting information. So a choice of language is quite interesting. However, several recent studies on Seleucid propaganda and stelae suggest that ordinary people were kind of expected to be able to read public inscriptions written in the state language. This theory explains why such great expense goes to creating public inscriptions and explains why inscriptions are often so formulaic. Formulas are easy to learn and recognize if you can expect them on every stele or inscription. Many funerary inscriptions follow similar patterns of expression. So might this perhaps be an aid not just of custom in the scribes or stoneworkers training in certain formulas that he knows and depends on, but also then because formulaic writing is easier for people with only functional literacy to read. This would also help us understand documentary writing in many ways too. All those tax receipts are very similar to each other. Inscriptions are driven by the service user. They require much interaction still between scribe and author, and considerations of audience, posterity, and public forms of writing. So I finished just on time if I had not been 15 minutes late, which is brilliant. So you all have been rescued and you can all go to your tea on time. No, I haven't actually finished. Sorry, I have another page and a half. I just looked at the clock, so it's fine. I'll just. Could I finish? Thank you.
I'll clap again.
Thank you. So finally, we'll turn to the last few words of an inscription from Jerusalem concerning Rufina, who I love Rufina, an arch-synagogos and patroness who offers an account of her deeds of patronage, which is burial for the buried freedmen and slaves concerning the inscription on the second half of page 2. The inscription then offers a curse for those that disturb the tomb. I don't know anybody who could afford 1,500 denarii. But anyway, but the last few lines are, a copy of this inscription has been deposited in the record office, which I really like. So towards a conclusion. As we conclude, I will offer a semi-relevant example from Egypt. For a long time, it was assumed, owing to Herodotus and all the fabulous things he did for history, that the physicians of Egypt never spoke to the embalmers, the people who do the mummification, because embalmers were apparently meant to be a, quote, hereditary and socially ostracized class. But this is not actually the case, as found in recent studies of Egyptian medicine. There is no evidence that embalmers were ostracized from society or that the positions were all hereditary only. And they did communicate fairly often with physicians, both sharing knowledge of anatomy. By comparison, the case between scribes and readers is not so extreme in our case of Greco-Roman scribes and ordinary Jewish society. The integration of documentary and literary products of scribes, however, needs some addressing so that archaeology and documents do not become the handmaiden of studies focused solely on how literature illuminates the practices of scribes, which illuminates how we understand biblical literature, which is a little bit circular. Fortunately, the corpus of evidence for Jewish writing and reading from inscriptions and documents, as well as archaeology and literature, of course, is vast for the Greco-Roman period, and we can, with time, find much to say about how scribes and readers interacted in order to create many of these reader-driven writings. We can find much to say also about what common principles and differences various types of writing and reading shares across media and contexts. I'm still at an early stage in my explorations of this topic. My main point at this stage, though, would be aligned with the idea in the title of this paper. Oh, I forgot all scribes, sorry. Okay, so this is a Roman funerary relief, and there's the butcher and the butcher's wife doing the accounts, which I just really like it, and using an excuse to show. Here's a Palestinian scribe from around 1948. He's working on the street. And there's Yaakov Washadi, the Yemenite scribe, and that's what the bigger picture. So he's, how do I get back? I guess. Look how happy he is. He really likes his job.
How do you know?
I think because he's smiling. That's a smile. He's smiling for the camera. I think he's enjoying his work so much. And this is a 4th century relief from Ostia. So this is a rhetorician. He's giving a speech, and there are people copying, like they did for Julius Caesar's speeches. And people discussing some books together, scribes and readers, or readers and readers interacting with some kind of book. But I'll leave it on Jacob, because he's my favorite. Yes, sorry, I'll just finish. So my main point at this stage is aligned with the idea in the title of this paper, that as I feel any exploration of scribal culture in the future must be methodologically balanced in types of evidence, resisting stratification of evidence. So one type of evidence cannot serve to inform another. Documents do not exist just to inform us about the Bible. They inform us about scribes and readers. And that scribal culture in biblical and Jewish studies to move forward, I feel, must be balanced and focused on the scribes and readers themselves, rather than solely on literature as a deciding framework for how we go about discovering who scribes and readers are. So perhaps this requires redefining scribal culture for ourselves before the subject becomes a lowly servant to studies of the formation of literature. Thank you.